January 14th, 2009, the Toronto Stock Exchange fell dead silent. A 114-year-old titan, the absolute pride of a nation, filed for bankruptcy protection. In cubicles and living rooms across the globe, over 90,000 employees watched their screens in disbelief. The seemingly invincible Northern Star had just collapsed. Just a decade earlier, Nortel Networks wasn't merely a company. It was the lifeblood of the global internet. At its peak, it commanded a staggering $398 billion valuation, making up a full third of the entire Canadian stock market. They built the fiber optic arteries that connected continents, with manufacturing hubs running relentlessly 24/7. Their workers were showered with lavish bonuses and stock options, living the absolute peak of the dot-com dream. But the dream was a mirage. Today, those sprawling, billion-dollar factories sit empty. The stock options are worthless paper. Tens of thousands of loyal workers were not just stripped of their jobs, but robbed of their hard-earned pensions and severance pay, left to face their twilight years in financial ruin. How does an empire that practically invented the modern telecommunications grid completely obliterate itself in less than 10 years? It wasn't foreign competition that killed them. It wasn't a lack of technological brilliance. A series of boardroom decisions destroyed tens of thousands of lives. Welcome to the darkest chapter in Canadian corporate history. This is the story of how blind ambition, toxic arrogance, and a trail of fabricated financial reports destroyed the greatest tech giant the nation had ever seen. Long before the internet connected the globe, and long before the frantic speculation of the dot-com boom, there was simply a factory floor in Montreal. The year was 1895. The company was named the Northern Electric and Manufacturing Company. It was born not out of an obsession with stock prices or global dominance, but out of absolute pragmatic necessity. Canada is a vast, unforgiving landscape. To connect the sprawling country, telecommunications required rugged, reliable equipment that could withstand brutal winters and immense distances. Northern Electric was established as the manufacturing arm of Bell Canada, tasked with a simple mandate: build the physical tools of communication. They manufactured fire alarm boxes, mechanical telephone switchboards, and the heavy copper wire that would literally tie a young nation together. For the first half of the 20th century, Northern Electric operated with the quiet, methodical rhythm of a traditional industrial powerhouse. The culture on the factory floor was rooted in deep blue-collar pride. It was an era of heavy metal stamping, of workers with grease on their hands carefully winding coils and assembling intricate physical mechanisms. Jobs at the plant were considered lifetime positions. It was common to see 2 or 3 generations of the same family clocking in at the same gate, taking immense pride in the tangible, heavy equipment rolling off the assembly lines. They were not chasing rapid exponential growth. They were building utilities meant to last decades. The true genius of the company, however, began to take shape not just in the metal presses, but in the minds of its engineers. In 1971, the company took a monumental step by combining its research and development departments with Bell Canada's to create Bell Northern Research, or BNR. Located in Ottawa, BNR quickly evolved into Canada's equivalent of Bell Labs in the United States. It became a sprawling brain trust, attracting the brightest engineering minds from across the globe. This fusion of highly disciplined manufacturing and world-class, unbridled research transformed the DNA of the company. It was no longer just making what it was told to make. It was inventing the future of communication. The blue-collar grit of the factory floor now had a brilliant academic counterpart. That intellect yielded its first world-changing breakthrough in 1979. While the rest of the telecommunications industry was still heavily reliant on analog mechanical switches, massive loud machines that physically connected telephone lines, Northern Electric, now rebranded as Northern Telecom, leaped into the future. They introduced the DMS-100, the digital multiplex system. The DMS-100 was a fully digital central office switch. It was quieter, infinitely more efficient, and capable of handling up to 100,000 telephone lines simultaneously. It was a technological marvel that sent shockwaves through the industry. Armed with this superior digital technology, Northern Telecom did something no Canadian manufacturer had managed before. They aggressively crossed the border into the United States. When the American telecommunications monopoly, AT&T, was broken up by antitrust regulators in 1984, the newly independent regional telephone companies needed equipment. Northern Telecom was there, waiting, with the best digital switches on the planet. The factories in Canada were suddenly running at full capacity to supply the American market. The revenues poured in, and the company's reputation as a quiet, reliable Canadian supplier was permanently altered. They were now a fiercely competitive global player. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the physical landscape of communication began to undergo another seismic shift. The heavy copper wires that had defined the company's origins were reaching their physical limits. Data, not just human voices, was beginning to flow across the world in rapidly increasing volumes. The future, the engineers at B&R realized, was not in copper, but in light. Fiber optics. By the mid-1990s, the company was fully pivoting to embrace this new frontier. To reflect its modern, global, and highly technical identity, the century-old name was retired. In 1998, they officially became Nortel Networks. The stage was set. The company had spent a century building a flawless foundation of manufacturing excellence and a world-renowned research division. They had the best products, the smartest engineers, and factories capable of scaling to meet incredible demand. But as the dawn of the internet age approached, the slow, methodical culture of a traditional telephone equipment supplier was about to be strapped to a financial rocket ship. The conservative, engineering-led ethos that had protected the company for 100 years was about to collide with the intoxicating, dangerous greed of the dot-com era. The Northern Spark was about to ignite a firestorm. By 1997, the world was waking up to a phenomenon that would permanently alter human existence: the World Wide Web. It was no longer a niche tool for academics and government agencies. It was rapidly becoming a global commercial frontier. But this sudden explosion of the internet created a massive, immediate problem. The existing telecommunications networks, built primarily for human voices over copper wires, were completely incapable of handling the sheer volume of data being generated. The digital highway was gridlocked. Telecom companies around the globe were desperate. They needed wider pipes. They needed unimaginable bandwidth. And as it turned out, the quiet, methodical engineers up in Canada had already built exactly what the world was begging for. Nortel Networks had perfected optical fiber transmission systems. While their competitors were still trying to maximize older technologies, Nortel introduced a piece of equipment that hit the market like a lightning bolt: the OC-192. This optical system could shoot 10 gigabits of data per second down a single strand of glass. To put that into perspective, it could transmit the entire contents of the Library of Congress across the country in a matter of seconds. It was a staggering technological triumph, putting Nortel years ahead of heavyweights like Lucent Technologies and Cisco Systems. With the undisputed best technology on the planet, Nortel needed a leader who could capitalize on this once-in-a-century market opportunity. Enter John Roth. Appointed as CEO in 1997, Roth was an engineer by training, but a ruthless, visionary capitalist by nature. He looked at the century-old, steady-paced culture of Northern Electric and decided it was entirely too slow for the internet age. Roth instituted a new corporate mantra: web speed. He demanded that the company pivot entirely away from its conservative roots and operate with the aggressive, breakneck velocity of a Silicon Valley startup. The message from the boardroom was clear: capture market share at all costs. Be first, be fastest, and dominate. The market responded with unprecedented euphoria. The late 1990s marked the birth of the dot-com bubble, an era where telecommunications companies, from established giants like AT&T to newly minted upstarts like WorldCom and Global Crossing, were raising billions of dollars from Wall Street and spending it instantly on network infrastructure. And they were all buying from Nortel. The manufacturing floors in Montreal, Ottawa, and newly expanded facilities around the world transformed into high-stakes 24/7 operations. The quiet pride of the old blue-collar days was replaced by a frantic, adrenaline-fueled frenzy. Assembly lines pushed out optical switches and network gear as fast as human hands and automated machines could assemble them. Workers who had spent decades meticulously building telephone boxes were now working endless overtime, frantically trying to meet an insatiable global demand. And they were getting wildly rich in the process. To align the workforce with his vision of web speed, John Roth aggressively expanded the company's stock option program. Suddenly, factory workers, assembly line supervisors, and mid-level engineers were holding options tied to a stock price that was defying gravity. In 1998, a share of Nortel traded for around $20. By mid-2000, as the dot-com mania reached its absolute zenith, the stock went parabolic, surging past $124. The wealth creation was nothing short of intoxicating. At its peak in the summer of 2000, Nortel Networks achieved a market capitalization of nearly $398 billion Canadian dollars. It became the most valuable company in Canadian history, single-handedly making up more than one-third of the total value of the Toronto Stock Exchange. A single tech giant was driving the entire national index. Inside the company, the atmosphere was electric. Millionaires were being minted on the factory floor. Longtime employees were cashing out options to buy sports cars, massive suburban estates, and vacation homes. The corporate campus in Ottawa felt less like a manufacturing firm and more like a victorious empire holding an endless parade. Headcount swelled to a staggering 94,500 employees globally. They were the undisputed kings of the new digital economy, wearing a trillion-dollar crown of optical glass. But the view from the absolute peak is dangerously deceiving. The brilliance of the dot-com boom blinded almost everyone to the fatal structural flaws being baked into the foundation of the company. To maintain the illusion of infinite growth and satisfy Wall Street's relentless demand for higher quarterly revenues, Nortel began engaging in highly aggressive business practices. Chief among them was vendor financing. Because many of the new tech startups buying Nortel's equipment didn't actually have the cash to pay for it, Nortel began lending them the money to buy Nortel's own gear. They were effectively acting as a bank, financing their own sales to inflate their revenue numbers. It was a brilliant strategy to capture market share on paper, but it meant that billions of dollars of reported revenue were tied up in loans to shaky companies with no real business models. The pressure to beat earnings estimates every single quarter became the sole driving force of the executive suite. The century-old ethos of building reliable machines was entirely eclipsed by the obsession with engineering a rising stock price. The Northern Star was burning brighter than ever, illuminating the global economy, but its core was beginning to rot. The empire was balancing on a knife edge of debt, hype, and impossible expectations, waiting for a single gust of wind to shatter the illusion. When a corporation's stock price defies all traditional metrics of reality, that stock ceases to be merely a reflection of value. It becomes a weapon. It becomes a new kind of currency, printed at will, seemingly backed by nothing but the boundless optimism of the internet age. For Nortel Networks in the late 1990s, sitting atop a trillion-dollar valuation, this currency burned a hole in the boardroom's pocket. CEO John Roth understood that the transition from traditional voice networks to high-speed data networks was a race against time. The internet was moving too fast for the methodical academic pace that had defined the company for a century. Historically, if Nortel needed a new piece of technology, they turned to Bell Northern Research, BNR, their world-class in-house laboratory. The engineers in Ottawa would spend years meticulously designing, testing, and perfecting a system before a single blueprint was ever sent to the manufacturing floor. It was a process built on absolute reliability. But in the dot-com era, years was an unacceptable timeline. Wall Street demanded new product announcements every quarter. The market was rewarding speed over stability and aggressive expansion over sustainable engineering. So, Roth made a fateful decision. If Nortel could not build the future fast enough, they would simply buy it. This marked a profound ideological shift. The company's focus pivoted sharply away from internal research and development, redirecting its immense capital toward Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Between 1997 and 2001, Nortel embarked on one of the most aggressive corporate shopping sprees in history, spending roughly $30 billion to acquire over 20 different technology companies. The mechanism behind this spending spree was dangerously simple. Because Nortel's stock was trading at astronomical highs, They rarely had to use actual cash to buy these companies. They paid in Nortel shares. It was a brilliant, intoxicating cycle. Announce the acquisition of a hot new internet startup, watch the market applaud the move by driving Nortel's stock price even higher, and then use that newly inflated stock to buy the next startup. The internal culture of the company fundamentally fractured during this period. The veteran engineers at B&R, who had dedicated their lives to building the robust infrastructure of the global telecom grid, found themselves increasingly sidelined. They watched in frustration as the executive suite showered billions of dollars on unproven startups, while internal projects were starved of attention. The message from the top was clear. The old guard of Canadian manufacturing was too slow. The future belonged to the aggressive, fast-talking entrepreneurs of the digital gold rush. But the executive suite was blinded by the glare of their own rising stock ticker. They were acquiring companies at a breakneck pace to construct a comprehensive, end-to-end data network portfolio, desperately trying to outmaneuver their bitter rival, Cisco Systems. In their haste to dominate the market, Nortel's leadership failed to recognize a fundamental truth of corporate physics. Buying a company on paper is merely a financial transaction. Integrating it into a century-old manufacturing and engineering ecosystem is a monumental operational challenge. As the new millennium approached, the sheer volume of these acquisitions began to choke the organization. They were swallowing companies whole, but they were entirely unable to digest them. The reality of Nortel's massive acquisition strategy was a logistical and cultural nightmare. The company was no longer a unified entity. It was rapidly devolving into a disjointed Frankenstein's monster of incompatible technologies and warring corporate cultures. The clash was jarring. Nortel was, at its core, a disciplined, process-oriented Canadian manufacturer. The companies they were absorbing were Wild West Silicon Valley startups, accustomed to operating with zero oversight, burning through cash, and pushing beta-level software to market. When Nortel purchased Bay Networks in 1998 for a staggering $9.1 billion, it was supposed to give them immediate dominance in the data routing market. Instead, it resulted in massive culture shock. Bay's executives clashed with Nortel's traditional management, leading to an exodus of the very talent Nortel had just paid billions to acquire. The acquisitions grew increasingly reckless as the dot-com bubble inflated. In 1999, Nortel bought a company called Catera for $3.25 billion. Catera was a startup focused on long-distance optical networking. At the time of the purchase, Catera had a handful of employees, no major customers, and had not yet generated a single dollar in revenue. Nortel was paying billions for an idea, a prototype, and the promise of future dominance. In 2000, they acquired Alteon Web Systems for over $7 billion in stock, a valuation that defied all traditional financial logic. Down on the factory floors and in the engineering labs, the chaos was palpable. Engineers were suddenly tasked with integrating hardware and software from dozens of different companies into the existing Nortel ecosystem. They frequently discovered that the revolutionary technology touted by the acquired startups was little more than vaporware, buggy, incompatible, and years away from being ready for mass manufacturing. Instead of accelerating Nortel's technological lead, the acquisitions were actively dragging down the company's core operations. Resources were diverted to fix broken code and redesign flawed hardware brought in from the outside. Simultaneously, a second, far more dangerous bubble was expanding in the company's financial ledgers. To keep revenues growing at the impossible 40 to 50% annual rate demanded by Wall Street, Nortel was aggressively accelerating its vendor financing program. They were lending billions of dollars to new, unproven telecommunications startups, companies like Winstar, Telligent, and 360 Networks, so that these startups could afford to buy Nortel's optical equipment. It was a perilous house of cards. Nortel was essentially paying for its own revenue. They were booking billions in sales, which drove the stock price higher, which allowed them to buy more companies. But the cash wasn't real. It was tied up in high-risk loans given to companies that had no profitable business models of their own. If the broader internet economy ever slowed down, those startups would default on their loans, and Nortel's revenue would evaporate overnight. By the end of the year 2000, Nortel Networks looked like an invincible empire from the outside, employing nearly 95,000 people and dominating the global optical market. But beneath the polished glass of its Ottawa headquarters, the foundation was buckling. They had abandoned their engineering roots for the casino of Wall Street. They were bloated with incompatible acquisitions, bleeding critical talent, and carrying billions in toxic, unsecured loans. The executives continued to project unwavering confidence, promising investors that the explosive growth would never end. But the dot-com clock had already run out. The music was about to stop, and Nortel was completely exposed. As the calendar flipped to the year 2001, the intoxicating euphoria of the new millennium began to sour. The dot-com bubble, inflated by years of blind speculation and infinite optimism, had finally reached its physical limit. And when it burst, it did not deflate slowly. It detonated, sending a shockwave directly into the heart of the telecommunications industry. The entire empire that Nortel had built over the previous 4 years was predicated on a single, unwavering belief: that internet traffic would continue to double every 3 months indefinitely. Wall Street analysts had convinced the world that the demand for bandwidth was insatiable. Based on this projection, telecommunications companies had spent billions laying millions of miles of fiber optic cables under oceans, across continents, and beneath city streets. But the projections were wrong, dangerously, catastrophically wrong. While internet usage was certainly growing, it was not multiplying at the frantic, exponential rate the industry had banked on. The result was a phenomenon known as dark fiber. Across the globe, vast networks of optical glass lay buried in the dirt, completely unlit and unused, because the consumer demand simply did not exist to fill them. The digital highway had been built to accommodate 1 billion speeding cars, but only a fraction of that traffic ever materialized. The realization struck the market with devastating force. As the venture capital funding dried up, the heavily hyped internet startups, the same companies that Nortel had been desperately relying on for revenue, began to run out of cash. The immediate reaction from these network operators was to halt all infrastructure spending. Almost overnight, the frantic ringing of the phones in Nortel's sales departments simply stopped. The trap of vendor financing abruptly snapped shut. The billions of dollars in high-risk loans that Nortel had extended to unproven startups became toxic. Companies like Winstar Communications and 360 Networks, which had been among Nortel's biggest buyers, suddenly filed for bankruptcy. The massive equipment orders they had placed were canceled. Worse still, the billions they already owed to Nortel for previous purchases would never be repaid. In an instant, what had been recorded on the balance sheets as guaranteed future revenue evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a smoking crater of bad debt. Inside the manufacturing plants in Montreal, Ottawa, and around the globe, the shift was jarring and violent. For years, the factory floors had been a blur of constant motion, operating on mandatory overtime to keep up with what seemed like endless global demand. Suddenly, assembly lines were halted mid-shift. Half-finished optical switches sat motionless on conveyor belts. The deafening roar of industrial production was replaced by a chilling, unnatural silence. The executives in the boardroom, who had spent the last several years acting as the undisputed masters of the universe, were entirely unprepared for a downturn of this magnitude. They had built a machine designed strictly for maximum acceleration. They had never bothered to install the brakes. In early 2001, as the order books dried up, management tried to maintain a facade of control. They issued statements to the press and investors, insisting that the market softening was a temporary blip, a minor inventory correction that would soon pass. But the numbers hidden in their internal ledgers told a completely different, horrifying story. The illusion was shattering. The facade finally crumbled in February 2001. In a devastating press release, Nortel was forced to slash its revenue forecasts and announced a staggering quarterly loss. It was the moment the market realized the emperor had no clothes. The reaction on the Toronto and New York stock exchanges was apocalyptic. The stock, which had seemed virtually immune to gravity just months prior, entered a terrifying freefall. It didn't just dip, it plummeted, shedding massive percentages of its value day after day. Investors who had bought into the hype panicked, initiating a massive, uncontrollable sell-off. The pride of the Canadian economy was bleeding out on the trading floor. But the true tragedy of the optical illusion was not measured in market capitalization, it was measured in human lives. To cultivate a culture of aggressive corporate loyalty, Nortel had heavily encouraged its workforce to invest their life savings and retirement funds directly into company stock. For years, as the shares climbed, employees had felt like financial geniuses. Factory floor managers, administrative assistants, and veteran engineers had looked at their portfolios and seen early retirements, college funds for their children, and generational wealth. As the stock chart began to look like a sheer cliff face, that wealth vanished. Employees watched in absolute horror as their life savings were vaporized in a matter of weeks. The paper millionaires of the dot-com boom were suddenly facing financial ruin, trapped in a sinking ship they had been repeatedly told was unsinkable. With revenues in free fall and the stock price collapsing, the executive suite resorted to the only lever they had left: brutal, indiscriminate cost-cutting. The era of lavish bonuses and corporate parades was replaced by the cold, sterile reality of mass layoffs. It began in waves. Thousands of workers were called into windowless conference rooms, handed manila envelopes containing severance packages, and escorted off the premises by security guards. The very people who had worked grueling, 80-hour weeks to build the fiber optic revolution were now being discarded to appease angry shareholders. Entire departments were dissolved overnight. In cities like Ottawa, where Nortel was the undisputed gravitational center of the local economy, the mass terminations sent shockwaves through the community, devastating local businesses, housing markets, and families. The psychological whiplash was profound. The workers who remained walked the sprawling, half-empty campuses in a state of perpetual anxiety, waiting for the next round of cuts. The deep-rooted pride of the old Northern Electric days, the belief that if you built a good, reliable product, you would have a job for life, was dead and buried. By the end of 2001, the stock had lost more than 90% of its peak value, trading in the single digits. Tens of thousands of employees had been purged from the payrolls. The optical illusion had been entirely stripped away, revealing a bloated, heavily indebted corporation struggling to survive in a nuclear winter of the telecom industry. Yet incredibly, the darkest chapter was still yet to come. As the legitimate business operations failed, a new leadership team would step into the vacuum. Desperate to stop the bleeding, halt the collapsing stock price, and trigger their own lucrative financial bonuses, they would abandon technology altogether. Instead, they would turn to the darkest, most deceptive tools of corporate survival: the accounting ledgers. As the dust settled on the catastrophic dot-com crash, Nortel Networks was a radically different entity. The visionary hubris of the late 1990s had been thoroughly discredited. In late 2001, as the company hemorrhaged billions of dollars and the stock price languished in the single digits, the board of directors sought a new kind of leader. They didn't want a technologist or a global visionary, they wanted a mechanic. They appointed Frank Dunn, the company's former chief financial officer, as the new CEO. Dunn was a strict, numbers-driven executive. He inherited a sprawling, wounded giant, and his mandate was absolute: stop the bleeding, stabilize the stock, and return the company to profitability at any human cost. To achieve this, the board of directors and management implemented a highly lucrative corporate incentive program known as the Return to Profitability, or RTP, bonus plan. The premise was straightforward. If the executive team could steer the company out of the red and post a legitimate quarterly profit, they would unlock tens of millions of dollars in personal cash bonuses. But there was a fundamental problem. The global telecommunications market was still frozen in a nuclear winter. Customers were not buying optical equipment. Legitimate operational revenue was still painfully scarce. The factories were quiet and inventory was collecting dust. You cannot engineer a financial turnaround when the fundamental business model is starving for demand. Faced with this impossible reality, the leadership team abandoned the factory floor and turned their attention to the only place they still had absolute control: the accounting ledgers. If they could not build their way back to profitability, they would calculate their way there. During the chaotic downsizing of 2001 and 2002, Nortel had taken massive financial charges, setting aside billions of dollars in accrued liabilities to cover the estimated costs of restructuring, broken contracts, and mass layoffs. These were financial shock absorbers, legally permitted estimates of future pain designed to clear the books. However, as 2002 bled into 2003, some of these anticipated costs turned out to be lower than expected. Under strict accounting rules, when a liability is no longer needed, it must be carefully and transparently reconciled. But within the executive suite of Nortel, these unspent reserves were not treated as administrative corrections. They were treated as a slush fund, a cookie jar. Instead of reporting the true, dismal state of the company's operational sales, management began systematically dipping into these financial reserves. They quietly released hundreds of millions of dollars of these accrued liabilities directly onto the income statement, registering them as artificial profit. It was an accounting mirage, meticulously designed to bridge the massive gap between the company's real-world failure and the financial targets required to trigger their own personal wealth. The engineers in Ottawa were desperately trying to design a way out of the crisis. The workers on the assembly lines were praying their jobs would survive another week. But behind the closed doors of the finance department, the numbers were being surgically manipulated to tell a story of recovery that simply did not exist. In the first quarter of 2003, the mirage was proudly unveiled to the public. Nortel Networks shocked Wall Street by reporting a profit of $54 million. The market, desperate for any sign of a tech turnaround, reacted with jubilation. Analysts praised the new management team for executing a miraculous corporate recovery in the midst of a historic industry depression. The stock price experienced a sudden, artificial surge, breathing a false sense of hope into the remaining workforce. But the most significant consequence of this fabricated profit occurred internally. Because the company had officially crossed the threshold into the black, the return to profitability bonuses were instantly triggered. In a spectacular display of corporate greed, CEO Frank Dunn and a tight circle of top executives awarded themselves tens of millions of dollars in cash bonuses. Dunn alone walked away with an RTP payout of over $2 million, on top of his already lavish base salary. This transfer of wealth happened precisely while the company was still aggressively laying off thousands of rank-and-file workers. Men and women who had dedicated 20 or 30 years to the company were being handed cardboard boxes and escorted to the parking lot, their severance packages slashed, while the architects of the company's financial ledgers were cashing multi-million-dollar checks based on phantom profits. It was a profound, devastating moral collapse. But the truth hidden in the labyrinth of corporate accounting is notoriously difficult to bury forever. By late 2003, the external auditors began to detect glaring inconsistencies in the books. The sudden, inexplicable shifts in reserve accounts could no longer be justified by standard accounting practices. As the questions mounted, the board of directors was forced to launch an independent internal review. Soon after, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and Canadian authorities launched their own aggressive investigations into Nortel's accounting practices. The unraveling was rapid and humiliating. In early 2004, the bombshell dropped. Nortel announced that its miraculous return to profitability had been an illusion. The company would have to restate years of financial results, erasing the fake profits and revealing the true devastating losses that had been hidden from the public. In April 2004, Frank Dunn and his top financial lieutenants were unceremoniously fired. They were escorted from the corporate headquarters, leaving behind a company in absolute ruins. While the executives would later face grueling criminal trials and, in a deeply controversial turn of events, eventually be acquitted years later due to the staggering complexity of proving criminal intent under existing accounting laws. The legal outcome was completely irrelevant to the survival of Nortel. The damage was fatal. In the corporate world, you can survive a flawed product strategy. You can survive an economic downturn, but you cannot survive the complete and total annihilation of trust. When the accounting scandal broke, Nortel's customers, the major telecommunications providers of the world, recoiled in horror. They could no longer trust the financial stability of the company supplying their most critical infrastructure. If Nortel was lying about its ledgers, what else were they lying about? The remaining orders evaporated. The stock price collapsed once again, this time permanently. The mirage had faded, and the true, hollowed-out skeleton of the Northern Star was finally exposed to the cold light of day. The firing of CEO Frank Dunn and his financial lieutenants in the spring of 2004 was meant to be a cleansing moment for Nortel Networks. The board of directors hoped that by excising the architects of the accounting scandal, the company could reset, rebuild trust, and finally get back to the business of building telecommunications equipment. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the damage. A corporation is not just a collection of factories, patents, and balance sheets. At its core, especially in the high-stakes world of global technology, a company is an ecosystem of human intelligence. For over a century, Nortel's greatest asset was not its manufacturing capacity. It was the brilliant, fiercely loyal engineering minds that walked through its doors every morning. And in the wake of the accounting mirage, that loyalty was permanently shattered. When the rank-and-file engineers and factory workers realized that the executive suite had been artificially manipulating the books to trigger multi-million-dollar personal bonuses, while simultaneously laying off tens of thousands of ordinary employees and watching the retirement funds of the workforce evaporate, a deep, irreversible cynicism took root. The social contract of the Northern Star was broken. What followed was not just a corporate decline, it was a mass exodus. It was a catastrophic bleeding of talent. The sprawling corporate campuses in Ottawa, once the vibrant, beating heart of Canada's tech industry, began to feel like the site of a slow-motion evacuation. The brightest engineers, the veteran system architects, and the brilliant researchers who had practically invented modern optical networking were no longer willing to tie their careers to a disgraced brand. They began packing up their desks, taking their decades of highly specialized knowledge with them, and they did not have to look far for new employment. Sensing the blood in the water, Nortel's fiercest global competitors swooped into Canada like vultures. Titans like Cisco Systems and Ericsson aggressively set up regional offices directly in Nortel's backyard, specifically targeting disgruntled employees. Even more consequentially, a rapidly rising, fiercely ambitious Chinese telecommunications company named Huawei recognized a historic opportunity. Huawei established a major research and development center in Ottawa, effectively placing a vacuum cleaner over Nortel's headquarters. They offered stable salaries, aggressive growth plans, and an escape from the suffocating corporate depression of Nortel. Hundreds and eventually thousands of Nortel's best minds simply walked across the street to the competition. They took with them the unwritten institutional knowledge, the problem-solving frameworks, and the visionary thinking that had once made Nortel an unstoppable force. Nortel was unwittingly arming its own executioners. Internally, the vacuum left by this brain drain was compounded by a paralyzing shift in corporate culture. In the aftermath of the SEC investigations, the company became completely consumed by legal compliance and historical audits. The executive suite became a revolving door. Bill Owens was brought in as CEO to stabilize the ship, followed shortly by Mike Zafirovsky, a former Motorola executive. These men inherited a company that was structurally traumatized. Instead of looking forward and designing the next generation of internet infrastructure, the entire organization was forced to look backward. Engineers and mid-level managers found themselves spending more time in windowless conference rooms answering questions from forensic accountants and corporate lawyers than they did in the laboratories. Innovation ground to an absolute halt. The defining corporate culture shifted from "how do we build the future" to "how do we avoid getting sued?" A culture of pervasive blame took over, with departments walling themselves off to avoid accountability for the ongoing financial mess. Down on the manufacturing floor, the reality of this systemic decline was stark and undeniably visible. The massive billion-dollar production facilities in Ontario, Montreal, and global hubs across Europe and the United States were turning into hollow, echoing caverns. Parking lots that had once required extensive shuttle bus systems to transport thousands of workers now sat largely empty, weeds beginning to push through the cracked asphalt. Layoffs were no longer a strategic reaction to a market downturn. They had become the company's only reliable operational rhythm. It was a grim, weekly routine. The employees who remained suffered from profound survivor's guilt, constantly waiting for the inevitable tap on the shoulder. They were tasked with maintaining legacy equipment, but the budget for new development was slashed to the bone. The company was cannibalizing its own future just to service the massive debt load acquired during its reckless expansion years earlier. By 2005 and 2006, Nortel Networks was a company in name only. It still possessed a massive patent portfolio and a significant global footprint, but the soul of the organization had been entirely hollowed out. Without its core intellectual talent, without a culture of innovation, and without the trust of its customers or its own workforce, the company was little more than a zombie corporation, a massive, aimless body stumbling forward without a brain. But even in this severely weakened, intellectually depleted state, the telecom market was evolving. A new generation of mobile technology was emerging, promising to bring high-speed data to wireless phones. To survive, the leadership knew they had to place one final, desperate bet on the future. It was a gamble that required flawless execution and deep technological foresight. Two things Nortel had completely lost. As the mid-2000s progressed, the telecommunications industry was quietly preparing for a tectonic shift. The era of laying fiber optic cables into office buildings and across ocean floors was largely complete. The new frontier was the air itself. Consumer habits were changing at an unprecedented pace. The world was on the verge of the smartphone revolution, a paradigm shift that would demand the transmission of massive amounts of data, not just over physical wires, but directly into the palms of millions of users. The global race to build the fourth generation of mobile networks, widely known as 4G, had officially begun. For Nortel Networks, this technological transition represented a final, desperate lifeline. The company was structurally crippled by the accounting scandals, suffocated by legacy debt, and suffering from a catastrophic mass exodus of its brightest engineering minds. Their traditional dominance in the optical hardware market had been steadily eroded by cheaper global competitors and their own internal paralysis. The executive suite, led by CEO Mike Zafirovsky, knew that the only way to save the Northern Star from total irrelevance was to capture this massive new wireless market. They needed a flagship product. They needed a miracle. But in the high-stakes world of global telecom standards, a corporation cannot simply guess the future. It must build that future in lockstep with the massive network operators who will eventually buy the equipment. At the time, the telecommunications industry was fiercely divided between two competing technologies for the future of mobile broadband. On one side was long-term evolution, or LTE. This technology was being developed as the natural incremental upgrade path for the world's major cellular carriers. It was incredibly complex, expensive to develop, and heavily championed by Nortel's bitter rivals like Ericsson. On the other side was WiMAX. Backed heavily by the computer industry, most notably Intel, WiMAX was essentially high-speed wireless internet broadcast over vast distances. It was built on an entirely different architectural foundation than traditional cellular networks, promising incredible speeds but requiring completely new infrastructure. Nortel was standing at the most critical technological crossroads in its 114-year history. They did not have the financial resources, the time, or the engineering manpower to develop both technologies simultaneously. They had to place all their remaining chips on a single square. In a decision that would ultimately seal the company's fate, Nortel's leadership looked at the landscape and chose WiMAX. The logic from a desperate boardroom's perspective was intoxicating. Because WiMAX was an entirely new disruptive standard, Nortel believed they could leapfrog their traditional competitors. If they could get to market first with the best WiMAX gear, they could bypass the grueling, expensive battle over LTE and establish an unassailable monopoly in a brand new wireless ecosystem. Furthermore, they believed the massive financial gravity of Intel and the PC industry would effectively force the global telecom operators to adopt the technology. To fund this massive gamble, Nortel made a devastating sacrifice. They systematically gutted their internal research and development budget for traditional cellular technologies, including their early promising work on LTE. They explicitly communicated to their largest historical customers, the massive global network operators, that Nortel was abandoning the LTE development race entirely. The company reorganized its remaining engineering talent, formed a joint venture with a wireless firm called Alvarian, and went completely all in on WiMAX. It was a spectacular, fatal miscalculation. The global telecommunications carriers, titans like AT&T, Verizon, and Vodafone, looked at WiMAX and balked. To implement WiMAX, these carriers would essentially have to build entirely new, parallel networks from scratch, securing new real estate and erecting new towers. It was a logistical nightmare and a financial black hole. LTE, on the other hand, was designed specifically to integrate seamlessly into their existing cell towers and legacy infrastructure. For the carriers, LTE was the safer, more logical evolution of their multi-billion-dollar businesses. By 2007, as Apple launched the iPhone and global demand for mobile data skyrocketed, the market's verdict was brutally delivered. The world's largest telecom operators universally rejected WiMAX as a mainstream cellular standard and committed hundreds of billions of dollars to building LTE networks. Nortel had built the wrong machine. The fallout was swift and absolute. Nortel found itself holding millions of dollars worth of WiMAX technology that nobody wanted to buy. Even worse, by explicitly abandoning LTE research years earlier, they had voluntarily removed themselves from the only market that actually mattered. When the major carriers opened their checkbooks to buy the next generation of 4G equipment, Nortel wasn't just losing the bids. They weren't even invited to the table. They had alienated their oldest, most lucrative clients and handed their remaining market share directly to their competitors. The fatal bet had been lost, and there was no more capital left to buy back into the game. The brilliant, methodical engineering culture that had defined the company for a century, the culture that had flawlessly predicted the digital switch in the fiber optic revolution, had been replaced by a boardroom desperate for a massive, quick-fix shortcut. As the calendar turned to 2008, Nortel Networks was a ghost ship. The WiMAX gamble had drained the last of their precious cash reserves. They were carrying nearly $4 billion in long-term debt, a toxic remnant of their blind expansion during the dot-com bubble. Their product line was irrelevant, their corporate reputation was in ruins, and their workforce was thoroughly demoralized. The company was entirely defenseless. And on the horizon, the darkest financial storm of the century, the 2008 global economic collapse was rapidly gathering. For the Northern Star, the question was no longer if they would survive, but simply what day the final bell would toll. By the autumn of 2008, the global financial system was collapsing. The subprime mortgage crisis in the United States had metastasized into a worldwide banking panic. Credit markets froze solid. Massive financial institutions evaporated overnight, and corporate spending across every sector ground to an immediate, terrifying halt. For a healthy corporation, the Great Recession was a brutal storm to weather. For Nortel Networks, it was an execution order. The company entered the financial crisis completely defenseless. They were still carrying billions of dollars in toxic debt from the dot-com era. Their product lines were bleeding market share, and their cash reserves were dangerously thin. As the global recession deepened, the telecom operators that still did business with Nortel aggressively slashed their capital expenditures. The few remaining equipment orders were canceled or delayed indefinitely. Revenue went into a fatal nosedive. The mathematics of survival simply no longer worked. Nortel had a massive debt interest payment coming due in January 2009. Without new sales and with global credit markets completely frozen, there was absolutely no way to borrow the money required to make the payment. The corporate treasury was effectively empty. As the winter of 2008 set in, the atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters in Ottawa was suffocating. The stock price, which had once proudly commanded $124 a share, plummeted to a few humiliating pennies. The New York Stock Exchange issued a formal warning that Nortel was on the verge of being delisted entirely. In a final, desperate plea for survival, the executive suite turned to the Canadian government. Nortel had been the crown jewel of the national economy, a massive employer, and the undisputed anchor of Canada's technology sector. Management hoped for a federal bailout, similar to the multi-billion-dollar lifelines being thrown to the auto industry across the border. But Ottawa looked at Nortel's hollowed-out operations, its history of accounting scandals, and its lack of competitive future technology, and made a cold, calculated decision. They turned their backs. There would be no rescue. The death knell sounded on the morning of January 14, 2009. With no cash left to satisfy its creditors, Nortel Networks officially filed for bankruptcy protection. Chapter 11 in the United States, and the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, CCAA, in Canada. The 114-year-old Titan, the company that had wired the nation and built the early arteries of the global internet, had flatlined. Inside the sprawling campuses in Ottawa, Montreal, and regional offices around the world, the news hit with the force of a physical blow. Even though the decline had been long and painful, the actual finality of the word bankruptcy shattered the remaining workforce. The scenes that played out across the facilities were deeply traumatic. Thousands of employees were summoned into massive cafeterias and conference centers to hear the announcement. There was no severance pay offered. There were no transition packages. People who had dedicated 20, 30, or even 40 years of their lives to the Northern Star were simply told to pack their belongings and leave. The hallways, once buzzing with the frantic energy of the dot-com boom, became silent corridors of grief. Grown men and women wept openly by the elevators. The unmistakable sound of packing tape echoing through the cubicles became the final soundtrack of the empire. Security guards, many of whom had worked alongside these engineers for decades, were forced to stand by the exits and silently watch their friends carry cardboard boxes out into the freezing Canadian winter. Down on the remaining factory floors, the visual was even more jarring. The massive automated assembly lines that had once pushed out the world's most advanced optical switches were abruptly powered down. Half-completed circuit boards were left sitting on the anti-static mats. The deafening rhythmic roar of industrial manufacturing was replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. The factories didn't transition or retool. They simply died mid-breath. For the employees walking to their cars for the last time, the overwhelming emotion was not just anger, it was a profound sense of mourning. They were mourning the loss of their livelihoods, certainly, but they were also mourning the destruction of a Canadian institution. They remembered the deep pride of the Northern Electric days, the absolute brilliance of the Bell Northern Research Labs, and the intoxicating triumphs of the late 90s. They had built something magnificent, only to watch it be dismantled by corporate greed, accounting fraud, and catastrophic executive gambling. But as the locked doors of the headquarters were chained shut and the liquidation lawyers descended upon the carcass of the company, a secondary, far more insidious tragedy was quietly unfolding. The bankruptcy protection allowed Nortel to immediately halt its massive debt payments to Wall Street banks. But it also allowed the corporation to halt its financial obligations to its own people. Behind the headlines of the corporate collapse, tens of thousands of retired workers, the very men and women whose physical labor had built the foundation of the company throughout the 20th century, were about to discover that their pensions, their medical benefits, and their life savings were locked inside a burning building with the exits entirely blocked by an army of corporate creditors. When a global corporation of Nortel's magnitude officially declares bankruptcy, it does not simply vanish into thin air. It enters a grotesque, protracted phase of corporate autopsy. The company is slowly and methodically carved up by liquidation lawyers, its physical assets and intellectual property sold off piece by piece to the highest bidder to satisfy an army of ravenous creditors. And Nortel, despite its catastrophic operational failures and executive incompetence, still possessed one extraordinarily valuable asset: its patents. The brilliant engineers who had been systematically ignored, mismanaged, and eventually laid off over the previous decade had spent their careers registering thousands of foundational patents. These patents covered the absolute core technologies of modern wireless communications, optical networking, and the nascent 4G infrastructure. In 2011, this massive intellectual portfolio was put on the auction block. The bidding war that ensued was completely unprecedented. A consortium of tech titans, including Apple, Microsoft, Ericsson, Sony, and BlackBerry's parent company, RIM, ultimately banded together to purchase the Nortel patent portfolio for an astronomical $4.5 billion in cash. It was, at the time, one of the largest single sales of intellectual property in human history. To the outside observer, this multi-billion-dollar windfall seemed like a miraculous salvation. Surely, with $4.5 billion injected directly into the bankruptcy estate, alongside billions more generated from the piecemeal sale of various business units to historical rivals, There would be more than enough capital to honor the company's fundamental commitments to its most vulnerable stakeholders, its retired workforce. But the cold, mechanical reality of corporate bankruptcy law dictates a very different hierarchy of human value. Under the legal frameworks governing the liquidation, retired employees, pensioners, and those on long-term disability were legally classified as unsecured creditors. They were pushed to the absolute back of the line, forced to wait while secured bondholders, massive hedge funds, and an army of bankruptcy professionals took their aggressive cuts first. And the professionals took a staggering cut. The Nortel bankruptcy evolved into one of the longest, most complex, and most ruthlessly expensive corporate liquidations in global history. For nearly a decade, teams of elite lawyers and forensic accountants in Toronto, Delaware, and London engaged in bitter, protracted jurisdictional warfare, fighting over exactly how the remaining billions should be divided across international borders. As the years dragged on, the legal and administrative fees quietly eclipsed an estimated $1 billion. $1 billion was drained directly from the carcass of the company, simply to pay the architects of its dismantling. Meanwhile, the human toll at the bottom of the financial hierarchy was devastating. In Canada, the Nortel Health and Welfare Trust, which had provided critical medical, dental, and life insurance benefits to thousands of retirees, was completely severed. Elderly men and women, many of whom had structured their entire lives around the ironclad promise of a corporate safety net, were suddenly forced to pay entirely out of pocket for life-saving medications and ongoing medical treatments. Even more tragically, the corporate pension plan itself was revealed to be massively underfunded. For those who had already retired, their monthly pension checks were violently slashed. For years, groups of elderly former workers organized protests outside courtrooms, holding signs bearing faded photographs of their decades on the assembly line, begging the legal system for the money they had rightfully earned. But the courts were entirely deaf to sentimentality. The cruelest blow, however, fell on the company's most vulnerable demographic. Hundreds of former employees who were on long-term disability, suffering from severe illnesses, workplace injuries, or terminal conditions. Their income replacement was abruptly and permanently terminated. They were abandoned by the very institution they had broken their bodies to build. The physical landscape of the Northern Star perfectly mirrored this human desolation. The staggering, futuristic corporate headquarters on Carling Avenue in Ottawa, a sprawling campus of glass and steel that once housed the world's brightest telecommunications minds, was sold off and eventually absorbed by the Canadian military to serve as a defense headquarters. The massive manufacturing plants across North America and Europe were stripped of their intricate machinery, repurposed into generic logistics warehouses, or simply left to decay. Their vast empty parking lots now serve as silent, concrete monuments to an erased empire. The fall of Nortel Networks was not merely the failure of a business strategy, it was the ultimate, brutal shattering of the post-war industrial social contract. For generations, the implicit agreement between the Western worker and the corporation was remarkably simple. Give us your absolute loyalty, your physical labor, and your intellectual brilliance, and we will ensure your financial security until the end of your days. Nortel proved, with devastating finality, that this contract was nothing more than an illusion. When the executives gambled recklessly and lost, they were shielded by multi-million-dollar bonuses, golden parachutes, and corporate indemnification. But when the company finally collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance, it was the workers on the factory floor, the engineers in the laboratories, and the elderly pensioners who were forced to pay the ultimate, unforgiving price. Today, if you drive past the old manufacturing sites in Montreal or the sprawling former headquarters in Ottawa, it is deeply unsettling to reconcile the dead silence of those buildings with the deafening roar of the empire that once stood there. Nortel Networks was not a victim of insurmountable foreign competition. It was not rendered obsolete by a sudden, mysterious technological leap it couldn't comprehend. It was murdered from within. The company was dismantled by a toxic corporate culture that ultimately prioritized the frantic speed of Wall Street over the discipline's stability of the factory floor. It was poisoned by a leadership team that believed financial ledgers could be artificially engineered with the same precision as a fiber optic cable. And when the grand illusion inevitably shattered, the architects of the disaster floated away safely, insulated by millions of dollars. leaving tens of thousands of dedicated men and women to absorb the devastating impact. The fall of Nortel stands as the ultimate cautionary tale of the modern corporate era. It serves as a grim reminder that an enterprise, no matter how historically significant or technologically brilliant, is only as strong as the trust it maintains. Trust with its customers, trust with its investors, and most importantly, trust with its workers. When a corporation begins to view its own people not as the bedrock of its success, but merely as disposable liabilities on a quarterly balance sheet, it has already begun to die. The physical buildings might remain standing for a few more years. The stock ticker might still falsely flash green for a few more quarters, but the soul of the machine is gone. The Northern Star did not simply burn out, it was actively extinguished by the very hands meant to guide it. What do you think was the absolute turning point that doomed Nortel? Was it the blind.com acquisitions, the unforgivable accounting mirage, or the fatal WiMAX gamble? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciate these deep dives into the rise, ruin, and human cost of global industries, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next documentary.